You're about to watch an interview with Jane Cooper, expert in English satire, discuss the two most sexually inept writers in history, Alexander Pope and Thomas Bernhard, and the ways in which their sexual ineptitude peeled into their works, great or not, you will soon discover. Now, this interview is much larger in reality, and the full thing can be accessed in the description below. But before you watch, let me just remind you, we have at Solomon & Smith started a Patreon, and all wealth can be tumbled into there for eternal glory in both the afterlife and indeed the present life. So keep that in mind. I'll just get done here. You enjoy the video.
Whereas with Pope, he famously, um, courted married women, as in he wrote letters, had quite intense friendships with them, but was always rejected romantically and sexually, is the implication, partly because he was about 4'11". And I think those instances of rejection led him to destroy the reputation of one or two of these women in his satires, but he never gave them any grace and didn't own up to the fact that he was probably being one of these men who's, pesters and accidentally like invites women to feel sorry for him and is a bit of a sad case. Whereas in this novel you get self-criticism in retrospect from the speaker, which is a bit, well, is quite nice, I think.
Yeah, I'm might be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure Bernhard died a virgin. I think he was
Pope did too.
thoroughly asexual throughout his life. Not like Pope. Maybe build up with some disappointment somewhere, but there did seem to be a genuine disinterest in love and no romantic love anywhere in his novels, which is really fascinating when you compare it to any other novel ever written, which tend to include romantic love somewhere or other.
Mm.
Um, you and there is sex is often come at from quite a oblique angle, and as far as I remember, in Woodcutters, the only reference is Auersperger's sort of attempt to rape uh, our speaker when he's a boy, a sort of with Nail and I, Uncle Monty situation, which was probably the main thing that the libel case was about, to be honest. All these,
Ah,
yeah, I sort of missed this the first time I read it,
yeah.
because it is gone over so briefly, and next to all these other long rants, you do miss this. In German, the verb he uses for sort of the sexual predatory behavior of Auersperger is auffressen. Hat versucht, die aufzufressen, which in English you might translate as devour.
Yeah, that's what in my translation it's
Yeah,
devour.
in like an animalistic kind of eating. He trapped them into his bedroom and then tried to devour them. Um, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it just brings to mind just on the kind of the Pope and his sexual mania thing. The one poem that seems to me an exception, but this might just be because I don't know that many of his poems. But Eloisa to Abelard, that sort of Ovidian epistle, which is very romantic and yearning and sad, and there's a lot of loss in there, and it's one of the few that isn't filled with a just extremely aggressive invective, maybe at the world, but in a sort of romantic camp that people would be more likely to nod at and be like, yeah, that is very sad. Let the lovers be together. Do you have
Hmm.
any insider knowledge on that one? Where's that coming from? Is this another Pope we have here, or just the only one of that genre that really made it out?
It's funny, like critics have tried to separate Pope into two popes, um, the two popes, and they usually do it in a half-hearted way I don't find convincing. Basically, Pope wrote in different genres, but he did seem to want to write to actually maybe attain something like the sublime, further to the end of his career. So an essay on criticism is the early essay, essay on man is later. Essay on man isn't about tearing down, it's about defending a very difficult thing to defend on its own terms sincerely and doing so in these wonderful couplets. And I think similarly, Eloisa to Abelard it's the closest thing you got to writing love. And it's similar, I think, in many ways to an essay on man. Of course, it like an essay on man, quotations get taken out of context and become very famous. So Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind being an Eloisa to Abelard quotation. And essay on man is full of them as well, hope springs eternal in the human breast and so on. So maybe there are two popes, and the later one is like, well, I've been criticizing others for so long. Why don't I put myself to the test and follow my own advice? There's that line in an essay on criticism, I think. Yes, let such teach others who themselves excel and censure freely who have written well. And perhaps he wanted to write well without, satirizing a bit later on. So maybe, yeah. He still wrote satire until the very end, though. The Epistle to
Yeah.
Arbuthnot, I think, is one of the latest ones. Yeah. But no, I mean,
I always
Pope
find it it's always kind of unconvincing when critics divide people. You get it a bit with biblical books, like these two bits of this book of the Bible must be two different authors because they have a different tone, as if a human being does not have enough inner variety to account for two tones. Yeah.
It is interesting with Pope, then we get a kind of one of the great 18th century poets who is great for saying all the other ones are terrible. And that's pretty much what his reputation rests on. And it reminds me of the early Keats, most of whose poems in the early period are just about how wonderful it is to write poetry. And you end up in this feedback loop. If all your great poetry is about how bad everyone else's poetry is, when do we get to your great poetry and, get back on track? And maybe Eloisa is the attempt. I think it is very good. It is very, very touching in a way that might have been embarrassing. I think had he gone through all this, then wrote a terrible love poem, maybe that would have been kind of the justifiable ending.
Yeah.
But glad he gave it a shot.
Yeah, I think I agree. I like that love is the subject that he finds it in himself to treat sincerely, given his own romantic trials and tribulations. And it reminds me of how that's the reverse in Dryden, because Dryden, when he selectively translates Lucretius, he translates from Book 4 of De Rerum Natura, which is the really devastating critique of love and infatuation, which basically says that love is a lie and that lovers are in a state of error and of being deceived because they see a very mediocre woman as being a muse. But I didn't recommend this before because it's not really satire, but Dryden's translation of Lucretius's Book 4 is amazing and it's so harsh. It's extraordinarily harsh both about women and how they're not all that, and about how young men let themselves be led astray by this fake, this erroneous view of women, which you get a bit in the Bernhard, right, when he's talking about how he can't believe he ever thought these people were interesting and really,
that is pretty pan gender though.
Yeah, that's he talks about certainly both genders.
It brings me to the sort of I guess the unofficial through line of this entire podcast experiment is that it's secretly all about translation. And with Rochester and with Pope and with Dryden, we have a tradition of large translations. Pope's Iliad, Dryden's Aeneid, and then Rochester, you get these bits and pieces, especially that Seneca segment seems to be one of his best poems, to my view. But what do you think about translation of this period? I mean, it had a very different method to modern translation, like Pope's Iliad, more of a sort of paraphrase than it is. And people say Pope didn't even know Greek very well. He just was sort of riffing
and Dryden's
on
Aeneid
it
as well. Well, I don't know about the Latin, but yeah.
Totally, this was translation was being theorized all the time, and the main point of agreement between everyone in the 17th century was you don't want to produce what's called a traduction, which is line by line or word by word literal translation, which then loses the meaning because it can't convey the spirit of the poem in a different context. So that they were talking about Englishing the classics so that they made sense in the way they would have made sense originally to listeners. But in England, where there is a civil war and where these morals can speak to new contexts, and so Cowley and Dryden in particular focus on imitation and paraphrase and amplification, and they say these are the real virtues of translating something like the Aeneid, whereas literalistic translations which try to preserve the exact number of lines or something are betraying the soul or the spirit of the text.
Oh, you're back. Well, I hope you enjoyed that discussion of Thomas Bernhard and Alexander Pope. Truly, they are sexually inept. But if you'd like to learn more about them, and indeed about Dryden and about the Earl of Rochester, then the link in the description will bring you to the full interview with Jane Cooper. And there's another link in the description, which is our Patreon. Now tip some wealth in there, and you'll receive glory, both in the afterlife and indeed the present life. Now, glad you enjoyed.